Good evening, and welcome to an extensive exploration of one of the most disturbing criminal cases in modern Russian history. We turn our attention to Alexander Yuryevich Pichushkin, born in 1974, a man who would later be dubbed the Chessboard Killer. Between 1992 and 2006, he embarked on a horrific path, ultimately confessing to murdering 48 individuals. He framed his goal in terms of a chessboard, aspiring to fill all 64 squares with the lives he took. The city of Moscow, with its sprawling parks and diverse population, served as the backdrop for these crimes. Bitsa Park, in particular, became the setting where many of his murders occurred. The revelations surrounding this case shocked not only Russia, but the wider global community, prompting questions about what drives a person to kill repeatedly while meticulously tracking each act. Over the next sections, we will explore the nuanced stories of those who fell victim to Pichushkin, delve into the police work that eventually led to his capture, analyze the psychological dimensions that shaped his actions, and consider the aftermath of one of the most chilling crime sprees in Russian memory. Let us begin with the journeys of his victims, as they ultimately form the heart of this story. Part 2. The victims' journeys, setting the stage. Bitsa Park and Moscow's shifting landscape to fully grasp the tragedy that befell Alexander Pichushkin's victims. It is helpful to step back and examine the broader environment in which these murders took place. Bitsa Park, located in the southern reaches of Moscow, sprawls over numerous acres of woodland, walking paths, and hidden clearings. In the 1990s and early 2000s, this natural enclave offered city dwellers a reprieve from bustling streets, though it also housed pockets of isolation where illicit activities might go unnoticed. The early 1990s marked the fall of the Soviet Union and the onset of rapid social and economic change. Many Muscovites saw their lives transformed. Government-run industries collapsed, new forms of private enterprise emerged, and the gap between rich and poor widened. Law enforcement faced budget cuts and challenges that limited their capacity to address every criminal issue comprehensively. Organized crime, petty theft, drug trafficking, and economic fraud competed for the attention of the police. Within this milieu, vulnerable individuals, often the elderly, homeless, or socially marginalized, slipped through the cracks of society, making them prime targets for someone intent on committing repeated murders. Bitsa Park, with its winding trails and poorly lit corners, became a grim stage. Over time, local residents grew wary of the rumors of individuals disappearing or being found dead under suspicious circumstances. Yet few imagined a single person was systematically targeting victims within the park. The murders eventually earned Pichushkin the reputation of a predator lurking in the shadows, but it took years for police to fully connect these seemingly isolated events. Early warning signs. The first known victim, one of the earliest documented victims, was a young acquaintance of Pichushkin's, identified in some accounts as Mikhail Odechuk. In 1992, when Pichushkin was still quite young, he lured Odechuk to a secluded spot. The precise details of that first murder are fragmentary, but it appears to have been driven by an internal impulse that would later define his pattern of violence. Some commentators have theorized that Pichushkin, who had experienced a head injury in childhood, was already exhibiting signs of aggression and social alienation that may have culminated in this first killing. What makes this initial murder so significant is that it set the precedent for future crimes. Although he did not yet articulate the chessboard goal, one might see this as the point where Pichushkin realized that he could kill and evade detection. Investigators at the time did not link Odechuk's disappearance to Pichushkin, allowing the budding killer to remain at large and ultimately to refine his methods. If law enforcement had zeroed in on him then, the brutal campaign that followed might have been curtailed. The vulnerable populations, social isolation, and economic hardship. As the 1990s progressed, the population that Pichushkin tended to target comprised individuals living on the margins. Many were older men surviving on small pensions. Others were homeless or struggling with alcoholism. Often, these individuals lacked close family ties, so their disappearances did not immediately register as emergencies. The more estranged a person was from reliable networks of care, the easier it was for Pichushkin to exploit their trust and lure them to secluded areas. One cannot fully separate this pattern from the wider social fabric of post-Soviet Russia. Economic and political transitions left certain groups particularly vulnerable. The abrupt shift to capitalism meant that large numbers of pensioners found their fixed incomes drastically devalued by inflation. State resources that once provided a safety net became scarcer. Meanwhile, mental health services for those displaying antisocial behavior were limited. This environment was fertile ground for predators who knew how to manipulate desperation or loneliness. Pichushkin's readiness to offer a drink or a sympathetic ear often opened the door to manipulative encounters. Encounters in the park, techniques of luring and deceit. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Pichushkin had developed a well-honed routine. He would approach individuals in or around Bitsa Park, sometimes meeting them in nearby neighborhoods or shops. Offering companionship and alcohol, he persuaded victims to accompany him deeper into the wooded areas. This tactic resonated with those who sought solace or a brief escape from their troubles. The combination of a lonely environment and the promise of a shared drink created circumstances where suspicion was minimal and defenses were lowered. One such victim was an older gentleman named Ivan, who had recently lost his wife. Feeling isolated, he frequented the local park to reminisce about the walks he once shared with her. Ivan's loneliness rendered him susceptible to Pichushkin's approach. The offer of conversation and vodka seemed harmless enough. What followed, tragically, was a fatal journey into a desolate corner of the park where Ivan was bludgeoned and left for dead. His body was discovered days later, though the connection to a serial killer remained obscure. The pattern of blunt forcer. The bottle and other weapons, a recurring element in Pichushkin's modus operandi, involved inflicting blunt force trauma to the victim's skull. Although he was versatile in using stones, pipes, or other heavy objects, a hammer appeared to be a favored instrument in many cases. The advantage of a hammer lay in its portability and relative inconspicuousness. Carrying a hammer in a bag or under a coat would not necessarily attract immediate attention, unlike a more overly dangerous weapon such as a firearm or a knife. Sometimes Pichushkin combined methods. In a few instances, he reportedly ambushed victims with a hammer blow and then threw them into open sewer pits or drainage wells located within the park. The horrifying reality is that some victims may have been alive when discarded in these wells, only to succumb to injuries or drowning. This chilling detail underscores the depth of Pichushkin's cruelty and his willingness to subject victims to agonizing final moments. Avenues for survival, missed opportunities, and narrow escapes. Not everyone who crossed paths with Pichushkin ended up a fatality. There were near misses and escapes that, in retrospect, highlight the precarious moments when a victim's intuition or external intervention saved a life. One anecdote involves a middle-aged man who initially accepted Pichushkin's invitation for a walk in Bitsa Park, but left abruptly, feeling an unshakable sense of unease. He later recalled Pichushkin's intense stare and odd remarks about death. While this individual survived, he did not connect the encounter to a possible murder at the time, and thus no immediate tip reached the authorities. Another potential victim was a woman named Tatiana, who lived in the vicinity of the park. She grew suspicious when Pichushkin insisted on taking a particularly secluded route. Something in his demeanor alarmed her, prompting her to fabricate an urgent errand and leave before they ventured deeper. These near encounters, although unreported in many official channels, might have served as warning signs if recognized collectively. However, the casual nature of these interactions, just two individuals sharing a brief drink, often meant people quickly forgot or dismissed them, lacking any concrete reason to involve the police. Shifting locations, Pichushkin's adaptability, contrary to some portrayals of serial killers who stick to a single ritual or location, Pichushkin showed a certain degree of flexibility. Nothing. While Bitsa Park remained his primary hunting ground, he sometimes moved within the park's vast expanse to avoid detection. If an area became too frequently patrolled or gained unwanted attention, he would select a new sector. This ability to adapt confounded early investigations, as the crime scenes were scattered across different zones of the park. Although the cause of death was often similar, blunt force trauma, the geographic diversity made linking cases more complex. In one scenario, a body was recovered near a children's playground on the edge of the park, prompting local families to fear letting their children play outside. Rumors circulated that wild dogs might be involved, a speculation occasionally fueled by the discovery of partial remains. Such theories inadvertently shielded Pichushkin by redirecting suspicion toward other sources of violence. Meanwhile, he maintained a seemingly normal existence, even holding down a job at a supermarket, further evading the label of a monstrous predator lurking among everyday citizens. The unseen agony. Families searching for answers. For every victim discovered, there was a circle of family members, friends, or acquaintances left behind, grappling with confusion and grief. Many victims disappeared without explanation, leading loved ones to undertake frantic searches. In some cases, weeks or months passed before a body was positively identified. Compounding the emotional toll, that heartbreak was worsened by the bureaucratic and investigative delays that accompanied many missing persons reports, especially for those who were older or lacked a stable address. Anna, the daughter of one victim, recounted how her father's disappearance was initially dismissed as a case of a pensioner wandering off or traveling to a rural area to visit distant relatives. By the time authorities took her reports seriously, critical evidence had dissipated. When her father's body was finally found, the passage of time made it difficult to determine the exact manner of his death. Only through later confessions by Pichushkin did the puzzle piece into a coherent, albeit tragic, whole. The chessboard concept and the psychological weight on victims, an especially haunting aspect of Pichushkin's approach, was his perceived tie to the chessboard motive. Though it was not publicly known while he was still active, the idea that he was aiming to fill all 64 squares on a chessboard of victims cast a dark symbolic shadow over the case. Each murder functioned as a step in this personal challenge. Victims were thus dehumanized, reduced to mere positions in a strategic game that existed largely in Pichushkin's mind. One might wonder what sense of significance he derived from this structure. Chess, a cerebral contest, became an allegory for control and domination. By assigning each murder to a square, he effectively numbered and cataloged human lives. Even though society at large did not learn of this dimension until after his confession, it adds a posthumous layer of horror for the relatives of his victims. They came to realize that their loved ones were pawns in someone's twisted quest for internal validation. Stories of specific victims, names and faces, while many victims remain either unidentified or known only by sparse details, a few cases have been documented with greater clarity. Understanding these personal stories adds depth to the tragedy. Vasily Petrov, since pseudonym, a retired railway mechanic, Vasily lived alone after his wife's death. He had limited pension funds and occasionally borrowed money from neighbors. He was known to take walks in Bitsa Park to clear his mind. One autumn evening, he failed to return. Days later, passers-by found his remains near a drainage pit. A blow to the head, consistent with Pichushkin's approach, suggested a swift attack. His daughter struggled for months to find closure, only to discover the horrifying truth after Pichushkin's eventual arrest. Marina Moskalieva, a colleague of Pichushkin's at a local supermarket. She represents one of the few victims who did not fit the typical profile of isolation and despair. However, she did trust Pichushkin enough to accompany him into the park, having conversed with him at work. Her fate became a turning point as she left a note that included Pichushkin's name and phone number, which ultimately led investigators to their primary suspect, Igor Sudanim, a homeless man who often slept on benches near the park's edge. He was known in the local community for collecting empty bottles to exchange for small sums of money. His vulnerability and routine presence in the vicinity made him an easy target. On a freezing winter night, he disappeared after being seen with a man matching Pichushkin's description. His body was discovered weeks later, partially covered by snow, complicating forensic analysis. An unidentified elderly woman, found with severe head wounds in a wooded area of the park. She became another statistic in the series of suspicious deaths. Because she lacked identification documents, it took considerable time before relatives located her through a missing persons list. They recounted that she suffered from mild dementia and occasionally wandered into unfamiliar places. For Pichushkin, her vulnerability was enough to mark her as a potential victim. And these stories illustrate the breadth of individuals who found themselves entangled in the Chessboard Killer scheme. Their backgrounds, personalities, and struggles may have varied, but they shared a tragic endpoint made possible by a lethal convergence of personal vulnerability, social neglect, and a single man's insatiable drive to kill. Cultural stigma and disconnected lives. A common thread linking many of Pichushkin's victims was a sense of disconnection, either from family units, economic opportunities, or mainstream social circles. In Russia, as in many other countries, homelessness or chronic alcoholism often carry significant stigma. Individuals grappling with these problems can find themselves overlooked. When they vanish, there might be little immediate outcry. Pichushkin was a keen observer of this dynamic. He capitalized on the fact that if no one urgently seeks a missing person, then he can more easily continue his pattern undetected. In a city as vast as Moscow, personal tragedies sometimes slip beneath the surface of collective awareness. A neighbor might notice someone missing, but assume they moved away or sought work elsewhere. A shopkeeper might remember seeing a local pensioner, but not dwell on their prolonged absence. This anonymity provided Pichushkin with opportunities to murder without quickly drawing a net of suspicion around him. The subtle signals. Foreshadowing in social interactions, certain coworkers and acquaintances later recalled disturbing hints in Pichushkin's behavior. He was known to be short, tempered at times, occasionally making morbid jokes or references to violence. He also displayed a certain fascination with how easily life could be ended, telling colleagues that killing someone was not as difficult as they might imagine. Such statements, often delivered in a half-jesting tone, were easy to dismiss as dark humor. Hindsight casts these remarks in a more ominous light, suggesting that his capacity for violence was lurking just beneath the surface. Not all his victims were total strangers. Some were people he knew casually, such as neighbors in his apartment complex. For instance, there was a case of a man who lived in the same building and sometimes drank with Pichushkin. The sense of familiarity could dissolve suspicions, making the victim more prone to trust. Inviting someone known to you for a walk in a park does not typically ring alarm bells, especially in a culture where communal outdoor gatherings and sharing vodka is not uncommon. Incremental steps toward the final tally in Pichushkin's post-arrest statements. He made repeated references to filling his chessboard. Each murder functioned as another square covered, another step toward a personally defined milestone. Some criminologists label this an ego-driven narrative, nothing, aimed at inflating his sense of importance or establishing a brand. Others point out that it is not unprecedented for serial killers to keep some form of detailed record or trophy. By itemizing his victims according to the squares on a board, he gave structure to his crimes, turning them into a grim ritual. This incremental approach might have also fed his compulsion. The knowledge that each killing advanced him toward a symbolic goal could have propelled him to continue, especially when he managed to avoid arrest for so many years. Once the murders escalated, every new victim seemingly emboldened him, reinforcing the idea that he was invincible or beyond the reach of law enforcement. The international perspective on serial killing. Although Russia had previously encountered notorious killers such as Andrei Chikatilo, the phenomenon of serial murder is still often shrouded in social and cultural taboo. Authorities can be slow to label someone a serial killer, and the public may struggle to accept that such a predator could exist among them. This reticence sometimes impedes swift police action, particularly when victims come from marginalized groups. In Pichushkin's case, skepticism about the presence of a single perpetrator allowed him to continue his streak of violence for an extended period. Across the globe, serial killers frequently target those they perceive as expendable or easily manipulated. They exploit vulnerabilities embedded in societal structures. Pichushkin's methods fit this pattern. He meticulously sought out individuals on the fringes and used a simple but effective ruse: alcohol, camaraderie, and the promise of a walk in a scenic park to accomplish his ends. These techniques bear a disturbing resemblance to tactics observed in other countries, underscoring the universal dangers faced by those who exist on the periphery. Cumulative fear and rumors in the community. As the number of inexplicable deaths in Bitsa Park mounted, residents traded rumors, each variation more terrifying than the last. Some suspected a rogue gang or a hidden cult. Others believed there might be a mentally unstable, homeless individual responsible for the violence. These speculative narratives spread through hushed conversations and local tabloids, fueling anxieties but not necessarily guiding the public any closer to the truth. Even the label, Bitsa Park Maniac, started to circulate, though the specifics of the crimes remained murky. For relatives of victims, the environment was fraught with uncertainty. The police could not always provide definitive answers, and each new body discovered in the park sparked fear among those who lived in the surrounding areas. Parents cautioned their children, and older residents who once found solace in evening strolls felt compelled to stay home after dark. This climate of dread painted a stark contrast to the everyday life of those who continued commuting, shopping, and socializing without interruption, unaware they were passing by a serial killer in their midst. Personal items left behind, the traces of lives. In the aftermath of many homicides, investigators recovered small personal belongings, watches, eyeglasses, scarves, or ID cards that provided fleeting glimpses into victims' identities. These items, once cherished or simply utilitarian, became stark reminders that each victim had a life replete with personal history. A battered wallet might reveal family photos or old receipts. A tattered notebook might contain handwritten notes about errands or heartfelt musings. Such items brought to light the ordinary human experiences, snuffed out by Pichushkin's violence. Forensic experts, working in the chaotic environment of the park's undergrowth, collected these fragments of evidence. While they offered some clues about the deceased, they did not always yield sufficient detail to link the murder to a single perpetrator. DNA and fingerprint technology were improving, but the logistical and financial constraints on law enforcement in Russia during that era made comprehensive testing a challenge. Consequently, many cases slipped into an investigative limbo, left unresolved until Pichushkin's eventual confession exposed the threads connecting them all. Confronting the idea of evil within media commentary and public discourse, speculation often turns to the nature of evil when examining cases like this. Some commentators draw on spiritual or religious explanations, positing that a demonic or otherworldly malice drives such acts. Others look to psychology, analyzing antisocial personality disorders, sociopathy, or psychopathy to account for the complete absence of empathy. Regardless of which lens one adopts, the systematic targeting of random individuals for personal gratification confronts society with a stark display of humanity's capacity for cruelty. Yet, fixating on concepts of evil can also obscure the more mundane realities that allowed these crimes to persist. In a society grappling with economic strains, corruption, and inadequate social services, a calculating individual can effectively act out violent impulses for an extended period. So while moral questions are pivotal, they do not alone explain why nobody intervened more swiftly. They do not rectify the fundamental systemic issues that made these victims so susceptible to a murderer's manipulations. Echoes of history, Russia's earlier encounters with serial killers. Before Pichushkin, Russia had already been confronted with horrifying serial killers, most notably Andrei Chikatilo, who murdered over 50 victims from the late 1970s to the early 1990s. The Soviet government initially resisted acknowledging the presence of such serial predators, insisting that serial murder was a capitalist phenomenon. This denial impeded investigations, allowing killers more room to operate. After the Soviet collapse, law enforcement agencies transitioned, but vestiges of those bureaucratic approaches lingered. The reluctance to label multiple killings as serial acts persisted into the era of Pichushkin's crimes. In a sense, Pichushkin's spree was an eerie extension of a pattern already established. While the official stance was no longer that serial murder was impossible, the systems to quickly detect and respond to repeated homicides were not fully optimized. Once again, the killer exploited this gap, preying on some of the most vulnerable people in a sprawling metropolis, shifting public consciousness and missed memorials. One tragedy is that many of Pichushkin's victims did not receive the public memorials or tributes that sometimes follow high-profile crimes. Newspapers reported on the mounting body count, but only a handful of victims were individually recognized. Without public mourning or widespread recognition, these individuals risked being forgotten. Their stories faded beneath the sensationalism surrounding the killer's nickname and twisted motivations. Some grassroots community groups later emerged to raise awareness about violence in public spaces, advocating for better lighting, increased patrols, and social initiatives to protect the elderly and the homeless. Yet the enduring question remains: would these efforts have been mobilized sooner if the victims had been part of more influential social groups, or if the public had been more conscious of the red flags? Toward an uncertain future, the last days of Pichushkin's spree. By 2005 and early 2006, the frequency of murders in Bitsa Park escalated. The press began referring to a probable serial killer, nothing, though the coverage was sometimes contradictory or sensational. Fearful rumors swirled, and law enforcement deployed more officers to the park's perimeter. Whether Pichushkin sensed a tightening net or believed he could continue indefinitely is unclear. Nevertheless, he continued seeking out victims. many of whom remained all too willing to share a vodka bottle with a neighborly stranger. In hindsight, it is almost miraculous that he was not identified sooner. He had a regular workplace, occasionally boasted of his strength, and left behind a trail of bodies in an area that was increasingly monitored. This final stretch underscores his audacity, or perhaps his overconfidence, in assuming that he had become untouchable. It was a delusion that would soon be shattered by a single piece of evidence left by one of his victims. An act that would unravel everything. Summation of the victim's journeys, reflecting on the extensive and often tragic accounts of Alexander Pichushkin's victims. We see individuals bound together by little more than happenstance and vulnerability. They crossed paths with a man who perceived their lives as tokens in a larger, cruel game. While some killers fixate on power, revenge, or sexual gratification, Pichushkin's central motive, aligning each murder with a move on an imaginary chessboard, lent his actions a chilling sense of methodical purpose. Each victim's story underscores larger social and institutional failings, highlighting gaps in public safety, policing, and communal vigilance. Friends, families, or entire neighborhoods sometimes missed signs that, in aggregate, might have exposed the predator earlier. The heartbreak felt by surviving loved ones remains immeasurable. In the next section, we turn to the lengthy and often frustrating process by which police, forensic specialists, and the broader justice system finally connected these crimes and apprehended the killer. The story of Pichushkin's capture is as important as the recounting of his victims' lives, for it reveals both the challenges and the triumphs of a society struggling to cope with a methodical murder hidden in its midst. Part 3. The investigation and capture, a gradual awakening of suspicion. Investigations into suspicious deaths in Bitsa Park began sporadically. Initially, each discovered body was treated as an isolated case of murder or manslaughter, though certain forensic details, particularly blunt force trauma, began to echo across multiple scenes. No immediate consensus emerged that the same individual was responsible. This segmented approach was reinforced by the fact that many victims lacked strong social ties. When they vanished, few pressed vigorously for answers. In a city with millions of residents, it was easy for names to slip off active investigation rosters. As rumors circulated about a potential serial killer, some junior detectives advocated a comprehensive review of unsolved homicides in the Bitsa Park vicinity. Their early attempts to collate data were hindered by bureaucratic inertia and resource shortages. However, each new body discovered slowly built momentum toward the acknowledgement that something more sinister was unfolding. A few breakaway investigators began quietly sharing notes, suspecting that the culprit might be a single individual adept at altering his method of approach. Occasional deviations in how the murders were executed, differing angles of blunt force trauma, the variation in items used as weapons, complicated the pattern recognition. The formalization of a task force, public pressure intensified as local media caught wind of repeated homicides in the park. Residents voiced anxiety at city council meetings, demanding heightened patrols and clearer communication from law enforcement. The mounting outcry eventually compelled the Moscow police to form a specialized task force. The group brought together homicide detectives, forensic specialists, psychologists, and prosecutors. Their objective was straightforward but daunting: connect the dots among dozens of unexplained deaths, determine if a serial killer was indeed active, and if so, stop him. Team members combed through a large backlog of missing persons reports. This labor-intensive process involved cross-referencing times and locations of disappearances with any discovered remains. The lead detectives sought a unifying thread, be it a particular weapon, a style of disposal, or a victim profile. Despite the complexity, certain patterns emerged. Many bodies were found in relatively secluded parts of the park, often near drainage wells or wooded clearings. The cause of death often involved severe head injuries, inflicted with blunt objects. While each case included unique elements, a chilling uniformity stood out when the puzzle pieces were placed side by side. Forensic advances and limitations. During the early 2000s, Russia's forensic capabilities were improving, but still lagged behind some Western nations in terms of funding and technological infrastructure. DNA analysis was possible but costly, and backlog delays were common. Many of the recovered bodies were decomposed or had been subjected to environmental elements that degraded crucial evidence. In some cases, animal predation further complicated the forensic picture. Despite these hurdles, the task force utilized what resources they had to confirm or rule out potential connections. They cataloged blood samples, hair strands, and fibers from crime scenes, sending the most promising material to specialized labs in Moscow. Some items linked victims to each other by showing consistent forensic patterns, though they did not always point to the same perpetrator. Shoe prints occasionally offered partial matches, suggesting that the suspect wore similar footwear, though brand and size were not definitively unique. More telling were the consistent patterns of head trauma and the repeated use of bits of park as a killing ground. Profiling the unknown killer, criminal profiling. While not as universally accepted in Russia as in some Western countries, played a role in shaping the task force's approach. Consulting psychologists and psychiatrists proposed that the offender was likely male, in his 20s to 40s, and possessed enough social skill to engage victims in conversation. The repetitive use of blunt force implied a personal or tactile dimension to the violence, as opposed to the emotional distance of a firearm. The location, an urban park, suggested that the killer felt comfortable in outdoor environments and likely possessed good knowledge of the terrain. Profiles also indicated that the offender might return to the scene of the crime or keep trophies. This line of thinking led the team to search for hidden caches or repeated vantage points, but months passed without definitive breakthroughs. The puzzle was missing a key link, a direct witness, physical evidence tying a suspect to a crime, or a survivor willing to describe the assailant in detail. Heightened patrols and media hysteria as fear mounted, uniformed and undercover officers increased their presence in the park. Some patrolled on foot, others used bicycles, and still others stationed themselves at strategic vantage points. The media ran stories about these patrols, attempting to reassure the public. In response, Pichushkin adapted. He became more selective, luring potential victims at times and places where he could avoid watchful eyes. The cat and mouse dynamic only heightened the tension. Some tabloids dramatized the situation with lurid headlines, occasionally hinting at supernatural or satanic elements. Other outlets criticized the police for failing to protect citizens, raising uncomfortable questions about whether socioeconomic biases led investigators to overlook the disappearances of those who were poor or socially marginalized. The task force found itself under pressure to produce results, even though leads remained sparse. The fatal clue, Marina Moskaleva's note. The turning point arrived in 2006, when Marina Moskaleva disappeared. Unlike many of Pichushkin's victims, Marina had a stable job and family connections. Before leaving for her fateful meeting with Pichushkin, she wrote a note to her son, indicating the name and phone number of the person she planned to meet. When she did not come home, her son shared this information with the police. For the first time, investigators had an actual name, Alexander Pichushkin, to go with a suspicious disappearance in Bitsa Park. The significance of this note was immense. One phone number linked the suspect directly to a missing woman, and that suspect happened to live near the crime scenes. police quickly located and detained Pichushkin for questioning. While many suspected criminals might deny all involvement, he offered a partial confession almost immediately, admitting that he had met Marina and that she was now dead. This admission, nothing, though only the tip of the iceberg, was enough to secure a formal arrest. Interrogations and mounting confessions. In the interrogation room, Alexander Pichushkin displayed a calm yet unnerving demeanor. Nothing. His initial statements were guarded, but over time, he unveiled details that matched unsolved murders in Bitsa Park. Detectives soon realized they had encountered a man whose crimes extended far beyond Marina Moskaleva's disappearance. According to various accounts, nothing. Pichushkin claimed to have killed more than 60 individuals, though the official count linked to him in court would be 48. Investigators tested his reliability by asking about specific crime scenes. He recalled minute details known only to the person responsible, such as the layout of certain hidden nooks or the objects left behind. Nothing. Each confirmation brought the task force closer to comprehending the full extent of his spree. For many officers, this was a moment of both triumph and horror. They were finally closing in on the killer, but the realization of how many lives had been lost and how easily he had navigated the city was deeply troubling. Nothing. Physical evidence and the chessboard, a search of Pichushkin's living quarters, yielded disturbing evidence, including a chessboard that appeared to track his homicidal progress. Reports vary on the exact markings, but it was clear that he used the board as a ledger, intending to fill all 64 squares with the names or symbols of his victims. This discovery was a bombshell for the press, who seized on the Chessboard Killer moniker. It was also a sobering affirmation for investigators, who realized that Pichushkin's deadly ambitions were meticulous, not merely impulsive. Other pieces of evidence included items that may have belonged to victims, scraps of clothing, small personal effects, and possibly souvenirs kept for reasons only Pichushkin fully understood. His calm explanations of these possessions left an indelible impression on the officers involved, reflecting an individual who had entirely compartmentalized the gravity of his actions. Linking prior cases, confirming each murder, required painstaking investigative work. Some of the homicides Pichushkin confessed to dated back over a decade, during which time records might have been lost or never adequately documented. Families of missing persons were contacted. Cold case files were reopened. In some instances, Pichushkin provided approximate dates or descriptions of victims that allowed investigators to match his statements to known but unsolved crimes. This corroboration process was time-consuming yet crucial for a future court prosecution. Prosecutors wanted more than just confessions. They sought tangible evidence linking Pichushkin to each victim. Where possible, detectives used archived forensic data, like consistent blunt trauma patterns or items discovered at the crime scene, to solidify each case. Media coverage and public reaction. As revelations poured in, Moscow's population reacted with shock and anger. News outlets in Russia and abroad ran extensive features on the Chessboard Killer, analyzing his methods and motives. Some recounted the city's history with serial murder, pointing out parallels to Chikatilo's rampage. Others speculated on societal factors that allowed a predator like Pichushkin to kill so prolifically. Psychological experts weighed in, offering their opinions on whether childhood trauma or neurological damage could explain his behavior. Public sentiment also expressed deep frustration at law enforcement's apparent inability to spot the pattern sooner. A wave of stories emerged about families who had tried to report missing relatives, only to face slow or dismissive responses. Although capturing Pichushkin provided relief, it also raised troubling questions about the structural shortcomings that let him operate unchecked for so long. From confession to courtroom, armed with extensive evidence and formal confessions, prosecutors prepared to bring Pichushkin to trial. None? They scrutinized every detail to ensure that the case would hold up in court, knowing that the Russian public and international observers would follow the proceedings closely. A key challenge was verifying each murder. While Pichushkin claimed over 60, only 48 could be definitively tied to him according to legal standards of proof. Some potential victims remained unidentified, their stories buried in the annals of unsolved crimes. The defense, such as it was, had little to contest regarding the central question of guilt. Instead, it occasionally attempted to argue diminished capacity or mental illness, suggesting Pichushkin could not be fully responsible for his actions. This line of reasoning met with skepticism. Court-appointed psychologists had already evaluated his mental state, labeling him sane enough to stand trial. The trial and conviction. Pichushkin's trial commenced in 2007. He appeared in a reinforced glass cage, a standard precaution for defendants in high-profile Russian cases. The prosecution outlined a catalog of murders, presenting crime scene photos, forensic analysis, and eyewitness accounts. Family members testified about their losses, painting a devastating portrait of lives ended without warning or mercy. Throughout the proceedings, Pichushkin showed little remorse. At times, he spoke in a measured, almost detached manner about the murders. This demeanor left a profound impression on those present, reinforcing the view that he lacked empathy. The court found him guilty on multiple counts of murder and sentenced him to life imprisonment, with the initial years in solitary confinement. Given the moratorium on the death penalty in Russia, this was the maximum punishment allowed. Aftermath: nothing. Searching for closure, the announcement of a guilty verdict provided some closure to victims' families, though it could not undo their pain. A collective sense of relief swept through the neighborhoods around Bitsa Park, knowing the predator who had haunted those paths was no longer free. Investigative journalists and criminologists continued to piece together the details, and the public devoured accounts of the Chessboard Killer in newspapers, magazines, and television documentaries. Yet questions lingered. Could the police have intervened earlier? How many murders had actually gone unverified? What systemic reforms were needed to prevent similar crimes? In the following years, officials introduced new measures to improve record keeping on missing persons and coordinate better among different law enforcement units. Community groups placed renewed emphasis on supporting vulnerable populations, though the effectiveness of these steps varied. Part 4: Free psychological analysis of the criminal. The roots of violence. Childhood and upbringing. Alexander Yuryevich Pichushkin was born in 1974, a period of late Soviet stability. Little in his early background suggested the making of a prolific killer, yet some glimpses offer insight. His father was apparently absent, and he grew up primarily under the care of his mother and possibly his maternal grandfather, who introduced him to chess. At a young age, Pichushkin suffered a severe head injury when he fell from a swing. This trauma, affecting the frontal cortex, may have compromised impulse control and emotional regulation. Yet childhood head injury alone does not suffice as an explanation for serial killing. Many children endure similar accidents without developing homicidal tendencies. Rather, nothing. The injury may have exacerbated pre-existing behavioral issues. Classmates described him as socially awkward and prone to sudden outbursts, while teachers sometimes labeled him difficult. These early patterns did not, however, automatically forecast the extreme violence to come. Chess. Intellectual pursuit turned dark obsession. Chess emerged as a significant influence in Pichushkin's adolescent years. Under the guidance of his grandfather, he found a structured environment where he could channel his analytical abilities. The game's demand for strategy and foresight appealed to him, providing a rare sense of mastery. Some accounts suggest that chess clubs brought him into contact with peers who respected his skill, a notable departure from the bullying or ostracism he faced elsewhere. Yet the symbolic power of chess eventually took a darker turn. He appropriated the chessboard as a metaphor for murder, each victim representing a square. Nothing. Psychologists surmise that the game's inherent motives of control, sacrifice, and victory dovetailed with his personal quest for dominance. It became a perverse blueprint for real-life violence. Nothing. Where methodical planning and the desire to checkmate society's rules replaced the more common motivations of greed or personal vendetta. Hallmarks of psychopathy. Evaluations following Pichushkin's arrest highlighted traits commonly associated with psychopathy: superficial charm, manipulative behavior, lack of remorse, and an absence of empathy. Witnesses noted his ability to appear personable when he wanted to be, especially in luring victims. While many serial killers operate in anonymity, Pichushkin did not shy away from the occasional brag in private circles, claiming it was easy to kill someone. This brazen attitude suggests a grandiose sense of self, another psychopathic indicator. Moreover, he displayed emotional shallowness in discussing the killings. Reports describe him as calm or even detached when recounting details that would horrify most people. This lack of emotional resonance with either the suffering of his victims or the grief of their families underscores a key element of psychopathy: the inability to internalize moral or emotional constraints. The reinforcement of success. One factor that likely emboldened Pichushkin was the success of his earlier murders. Nothing. After his first few kills went unnoticed or unsolved, he may have experienced a thrill that fueled subsequent acts. The repeated validation of getting away with murder fortified his sense of invincibility. Each successful murder became an internal reward, convincing him that he was beyond the reach of conventional morality or legal consequence. Additionally, his method of targeting marginalized individuals may have reflected a calculating assessment of risk. By preying on those who were less likely to be missed, he minimized the chance of immediate police scrutiny. This strategic selection process aligns well with a psychopathic mindset that weighs the benefits and risks of each action. Possible comorbidities. Substance use and sadistic impulses. Alcohol played a dual role in Pichushkin's crimes. Often, he shared vodka with his victims to lower their defenses. Nothing. It is not entirely clear whether he himself drank to the point of impairment, but alcohol likely facilitated the environment in which these murders occurred. While not all murders involved alcohol, many did, suggesting its importance as a social lubricant that made victims more pliable and unsuspecting. Some of his acts also hint at sadistic elements. The brutality of bashing a victim's skull and sometimes pushing them into a sewer while still alive suggests enjoyment of control over life and death. Yet Pichushkin did not appear to derive overt sexual gratification from his killings, distinguishing him from certain other types of serial murderers. Instead, the satisfaction seems rooted in power and a twisted sense of achievement. The chessboard as a grandiose project, the drive to fill 64 squares, can be read as a grandiose fantasy. Each killing represented another piece in a narrative in which Pichushkin cast himself as a master strategist, playing a high-stakes game with society. This metaphor might have also served as a psychological buffer, distancing him from the visceral reality of taking lives. By conceptualizing the victims as chess pieces, he reduced them to objects in a puzzle, stripping them of human qualities that might otherwise evoke moral hesitation. In forensic psychology, this form of objectification is a common tactic among offenders who need to rationalize or compartmentalize their actions. The repeated reference to the chessboard in his confessions suggests that it became a powerful internal motivator, inspiring him to continue even when suspicion around Bitsa Park mounted. Comparisons to other notorious killers, criminologists have drawn parallels between Pichushkin and historical figures like Andrei Chikatilo, who also terrorized Russia with a spree of serial murders. While both exhibited psychopathic traits and targeted vulnerable victims, Chikatilo's crimes had a strong sexual component, whereas Pichushkin's seemed more oriented around power, control, and a personal ideological goal. International analogues might include killers who keep score or trophies, such as the BTK killer in the United States, though the details of their motives and methods differ. What sets Pichushkin apart is the blend of chess symbolism, post-Soviet social context, and the sheer longevity of his spree. His willingness to adapt and his methodical approach reveal an offender who understood how to manipulate conditions for his advantage. This trait, combined with psychopathy, placed him among the ranks of serial killers who mystify the public by hiding in plain sight. Socioeconomic and cultural dimensions. While psychopathy is a key element in understanding Pichushkin, his environment also played a crucial role. Growing up amid the socioeconomic upheaval of post-Soviet Russia, he encountered a society with weakening community structures and policing standards. Serial killers often capitalize on vulnerabilities within their environment. Pichushkin did so by focusing on individuals who existed at the fringes and by exploiting the labyrinthine nature of Bitsa Park. The combination of personal pathology and broader social context helped him avoid detection for years. His mental framework, one devoid of empathy, found fertile ground in a place where an individual's sudden absence might not trigger an immediate manhunt. In effect, the city unwittingly accommodated his lethal pastime. Incarceration and continued exhibitions of personality. After his arrest, Pichushkin continued to demonstrate hallmark psychopathic traits. Nothing. He gave interviews where he boasted about his intelligence or his skill in evading capture. In these statements, he framed his killings as though they were an intricate game, casting himself as a misunderstood anti-hero. Such rhetoric points to a persistent lack of remorse. It also aligns with a pattern of serial killers who remain narcissistic and manipulative behind bars, seeking attention or admiration from the media, fellow inmates, or staff. Experts argue that effective rehabilitation for someone like Pichushkin is highly unlikely. Psychopathy, especially in severe forms, resists traditional therapeutic approaches. His life sentence ensures he remains isolated from society, mitigating the risk of reoffending, but leaving many questions about how to address individuals who derive their sense of identity from destructive acts. Implications for future prevention. From a preventative standpoint, Pichushkin's case underscores the need for a multi-layered response. Early intervention in childhood behavioral issues, including proper evaluation after traumatic brain injuries, might provide pathways to reduce violence risk. Better resourcing for law enforcement, streamlined processes for missing persons, nothing and social support networks for vulnerable populations also limit the opportunities for predators to thrive. Ultimately, the Chessboard Killer offers a stark reminder that psychopathic individuals can innovate ways to commit repeated violence if the environment permits. While it may be impossible to eliminate such threats entirely, a more cohesive societal response can detect early warning signs, ensure thorough investigations, and curtail extended killing sprees. Understanding the psychological forces at play helps identify potential patterns, but building robust community and institutional safeguards is critical in preventing future tragedies of this scale. Part 5 to conclusion. In reviewing the entire arc of Alexander Pichushkin's criminal career, from his early life to his eventual capture, several themes emerge. First, his murders took root in the social and economic shifts of post-Soviet Russia, a time when many vulnerable individuals found themselves as isolated or overlooked. Second, his reliance on Bitsu Park, a vast and sometimes under-monitored natural space, afforded him ample opportunities to carry out his violent acts in relative secrecy. Third, his symbolic use of the chessboard as a marker of each victim highlights the methodical nature of his intentions. Far from impulsive or random, these killings functioned as a coherent, if horrifying, narrative in his mind. Crucially, Pichushkin's spree might not have endured so long if law enforcement agencies had been better equipped and more attuned to the patterns of violence in marginalized communities. Nothing. Fragmented investigative approaches, limited forensic resources, and societal indifference toward the homeless and the elderly all created conditions in which he could operate. When the police did begin to suspect a single individual, the lack of a unifying evidence base delayed effective action. Only when Marina Moskleyova's note pointed directly to him did the efforts crystallize into a successful arrest. Psychological examinations revealed traits consistent with psychopathy. He exhibited neither empathy for his victims nor remorse for his actions. Instead, he regarded murder as a purposeful quest that gave meaning to his life. His intelligence, combined with a complete disregard for human life, enabled him to remain hidden in plain sight for nearly 15 years. As with other notorious killers, public fascination and horror have kept his story alive long after his conviction. Yet it is the victims' experiences that most deserve our attention. They were individuals who, for various reasons, lacked the protection or awareness that might have saved them. Their stories point to the social gaps and institutional failings that leave certain groups particularly vulnerable to predators. Although Pichushkin now serves a life sentence, his dark legacy endures as a warning of how easily a calculating murderer can exploit communal blind spots. Thank you for accompanying me on this thorough examination of Alexander Pichushkin's case. If you found this content informative or thought-provoking, I invite you to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows me to continue producing in-depth true crime discussions that shed light on the complexities of criminal behavior and the societal factors that shape it. May we use these insights to foster greater vigilance, empathy, and action in preventing future tragedies. Stay informed and stay safe.